For today, how much does it matter that so many Muslims in America have problems with Israel to the point of being blatantly anti-Semitic? Well, my next guest notes in a recent article that we can learn a lot about this from an event that took place 90 years ago this month, the Hebron riots of 1929. And he says in that jihad carnage of Jews celebrated then by the Soviet Communist movement, the annihilationist Jew hatred of the jihadist, green Marxist Red Alliance lives on today, and it's now embodied by the views and perspective of American Muslim Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. Joining us now, Dr. Andrew Bostom, Associate Professor of Family Medicine, the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University, and the author of several great books, including The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism. Dr. Bostom, it's wonderful to welcome you back. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for having me on, Jan.
Well, thank you for being here. I would imagine there are many listeners who are not necessarily familiar with what went on 90 years ago, this Hebron riots, incident of 1929, the Arab Muslim Jihad. Tell us what happened and why it's important for people to know about it.
Well, this was a series actually of pogroms, and the largest happened to be based out of Hebron. It was incited by the godfather, actually, of the Palestinian Muslim movement, Hashim el-Husani, who was really sort of a prototypical theocrat for the 20th century. But at any rate, he was very adept at inciting the Arab masses in Palestine, and he would use traditional Islamic themes of anti-Semitism that unfortunately are rife in the Quran and the traditions of Muhammad, but ostensibly it had to do with Jews violating what had been a prohibition for praying on what is the old temple, but of course, which with the conquest of historical Palestine, the Temple Mount was turned into a mosque, and so it had to do with ginning up that particular controversy, but it exploded into riots across Palestine at the time, with 67 being killed in Hebron itself, but also in Jerusalem there were 31 killed, in Safat 20 killed, in Jaffa 8 killed, in Haifa 6 killed, and many wounded. And by the end of this week long of attacks, there were 133 Jews killed and 241 injured. And what was particularly, and in very, very gruesome ways, I mean, the eyewitness accounts, which reached the American press but were recorded locally, rape, torture, beheadings, throat slitting, mutilation, just really merciless killings that took place by really frenzied mobs. But what was shocking to me, and I did not know about until about the last year or so, was that the communist Marxist press in the United States, in Palestine itself, celebrated these horrific attacks. In fact, there were cartoons that ran within less than a week of this carnage in Yiddish communist newspaper from New York called Morning Freiheit, and they were no different. When you look at these images, Janet, they were no different than what you would see at that time, or starting to come out from Julius Streicher and Der Stürmer. I mean, these kinds of grotesque images, but the Jews were basically culpable for their own massacre. It was just incredible, and even more interesting was to see confirmation from Whittaker Chambers, the ex-communist, the brilliant writer. He was at that period a movement communist, and he was the head of he was the editor-writer for the Daily Worker, and he was describing the insanity of this type of caricature and attack on the Jews, and he said it was like horseplay in a mental home. That's how he described it, and they really wanted a Soviet Arabistan at the time. So there was a lot of confirmation of this, that the Marxists glommed on to this terrible carnage that was being committed, and I see sort of a pattern of this when you fast forward 90 years to Tlaib and Omar. I mean, their embrace of BDS is a movement that includes, BDS movement itself includes elements of all the terror organizations that have been affiliated with the Palestinian movement, from the Marxist PFLP, which has a 50-year pedigree of attacks, to the obviously jihadist ones like Hamas, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. BDS actually has operatives from those organizations in it, and this is the organization that Tlaib and Omar really support to the hilt.
Yeah.
So to me, it makes them, it's not, they aren't necessarily calling themselves for these kinds of massacres, but certainly the organization that they support includes people who clearly imbibe those ideologies, those really genocidal ideologies.
Right. Well, BDS and their support for BDS was very significant concerning their desire to go over to Israel and why they were denied the right to go over to Israel. And then, of course, Tlaib was allowed to go over to see her grandma and then said thanks but no thanks after, doing a sob story. But, I mean, this is significant, though, because when you're talking about Soviet communist support for what went on in 1929, I'm sure people will wonder why. What is the connection there between the Marxists and the jihadists? Why in the world would they be in favor of that? What's the connection?
It's very interesting because I again, this is something I only learned about within the past, really, in this case, 6 months. Marx himself, it literally goes back to Marx himself. He was the original proponent of what's now come to be known as the Red-Green Alliance. He actually wrote letters supporting the tottering Ottoman Empire and their jihad against Tsarist Russia to foment revolution in Russia itself and then spread that revolution throughout Europe. So in other words, he thought of the jihad as an instrument that basically helped facilitate the worldwide revolution that he had in mind. And something very interesting also is that I don't know whether this was some sort of organic phenomenon, Janet, but if you look at the Muslim profession of faith, there is no God other than Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. Well, literally, to be a movement Marxist in Germany and in England this is even before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, you would have to pledge your allegiance by saying, there is no God and Karl Marx is his prophet.
Wow.
I mean, so this is how, compatible, and a lot of ex-communists through the early to mid-20th century wrote about the striking similarities between Marxism and communism in terms of world conquest and in terms of a very totalitarian outlook, period.
Yeah, but he was born Jewish. I mean, I know his parents converted later to, I think, Lutheranism, but that seems like an odd thing. Otherwise,
Well, actually, Marx's father was even a rabbi for a period of time. He converted professionally when he became a lawyer to facilitate his career, but he baptized. Marx himself was never Jewish. Marx was baptized, and that's the other thing. Marx was virulently anti-Semitic as an adult, certainly, and in his writings on the Jews. I mean, 80 years before Mein Kampf, you see the same annihilationist Jew hatred preached by Marx himself. So there's no question, and really vile stuff, referring to Jews as odorous and wanting to eliminate the Jew. So the social emancipation of Jewry is the emancipation of society from Jewry, and Jews are just usurious, and basically Judaism should be eliminated. I mean, this is what Marx preached.
Yeah. Well, it's terrifying, but what's really terrifying is the fact that we're seeing the same alliance, as we've discussed before, emerging in the United States. And one of the things that I want to get into when we come back from the break is this recent interview that was done with Representative Mo Brooks. Now, Ilhan Omar and Mo Brooks, there's no love lost there for various reasons. But it's very interesting because you unearthed this audio, Dr. Bostom, and I want to play it when we come back from the break so people can hear what Mo Brooks thinks is really going to happen if the Democrats continue in the direction that they've decided to go. We're going to come back right after this break. You're listening to Janet Mefford Today. Stay with us.